We had a few questions that we wanted to ask with this study. We wanted to know what is the best available information out there that we could use to try and look at agricultural productivity and poverty in India. We've heard a lot about 95% of your time spent collecting data, 5% of the time doing the analysis. I think we kind of ran into that problem in this particular case study. I think the message there is that the situation is improving in terms of access to data. We were able to pull in a lot of stuff that I didn't think we could have done at the beginning, but we didn't quite get to where we wanted to be. But still, we have some interesting ideas to share with you. And that led to the case study then. Did we see any evidence of increased agricultural productivity leading to a reduction in rural poverty in India? So we spent a lot of time trying to find out what is out there in terms of the data sets in India. And we wanted to contribute in several different ways to the whole Geoshare ethos. And the first basic thing we wanted to do was to say, well, if data sets like SPAM and MERCA want to be updated every 5 years, for example, how can we contribute and get better detailed data on the major crops? So we were able to pull together district level data for about 20 crops and make that available. And then we wanted to look more at the time series. If you want to understand growth, we needed to look over a much longer time period, looking at state level changes in area and production, looking at state level changes in the cost of cultivation, so not just area and production and yield, looking at wages, and at the same time finding consistent poverty data that matched that same time series. And that proved to be a challenge. You'll see we've got this kind of awkward set of dates. Ideally, we wanted 2000, 2005, 2010. But when we started to look at the poverty data that was available in a consistent measurement system, these were the three dates we could find: 93, 2005, 2010. There was a 2000 data set, but it just wasn't using the same metric for poverty. So we ended up with some good spatial detail, which I'm not really going to talk about much here because it's been presented so well by the work Stefan has done. But the temporal data, this was really important for us, assessment of the relationship between poverty and growth. Very quickly, I'll talk about some of the basic data sets we were able to pull together, looking at changes in growth rate and yield, 93 to 2005, and then over the whole period, 93 to 2010. And looking at the spatial differences in the annual growth rate. Some states, you see some huge disparities, some huge spatial variations in growth rate, and that's all I really want to say is the message here. We talk about growth in a country, but we see large variations from place to place, from crop to crop. If we look at the same for maize, the growth negative in some places and positive in others. It's very different from the rice trends that we observed over the same period. And the same for the next major crop, wheat. And we could do this for all the other crops that we were able to get data for. But I don't really want to focus too much on this. What I'm really interested in talking about is the poverty dimension. We haven't talked about that much today. But when it comes down to looking at productivity and rural growth, what we really want to talk about is the impacts this may have on poverty. And these three maps are just showing the three different time periods where we had data: 93, 94, 2004, 2005, and 2010, and simply colored by the proportion of people living below the poverty line on those three dates. And you can see some pretty dramatic changes from 93 all the way through to 2009-10. Some significant reduction in poverty in certain areas, but some states where it's still stubbornly high. Figures over 50% in terms of the poverty rate in these areas. And these are all based on the same consistent measurement of poverty. What I've done here is change that into a graph that represents the whole country. So on the top here, we're looking at the changes in rural poverty in India, and this is rural poverty in 93, and this is the poverty rate and the proportion of the population living at that particular poverty rate. Now in 93, 94, the average rural poverty rate for India was about 50%. But you can see the distribution across the country varies between some states up at about 70% or 65%, and some at 30. The urban poverty rate at the same time was about 30%. This is just showing you the distribution of that. If we move to 2004, 2005, we see this wonderful shift to the left. The poverty reduces over that time. Go to 2009, 2010, again, another wonderful shift to the left, poverty reducing over time. But what we're starting to see is some very awkward areas that are being left behind. So overall, good news. Poverty reduction over time. Rural poverty dramatically fell from 50% to 34%. Urban poverty from 32 to 21. But we're starting to see a divergence. Some areas, which I've shaded in here, kind of stuck, not making the same progress as other states. So this was all kind of interesting backdrop, all kind of interesting stories for us to start to get our teeth into. And Stefan had some really big figures on India earlier on. Here are some more big figures on India. Agriculture is still a major component of the GDP for the country. It's 14%. And it's still the single largest employer. So when you're talking about rural poverty, you think agricultural growth is going to have a contribution to lifting those rural areas out of poverty. What we've seen is that yield growth in staples seems to have increased recently. The rate of yield growth has improved in some states. But there's plenty of evidence that people are moving from staple crops to high-value crops as well. And despite some really impressive gains in poverty reduction, India is still home to about 1/3 of the world's poor. It's about 400 million people using this World Bank metric of $1.25 a day. That's about the same number of poor people who live in the whole continent of Africa, just to put things into perspective. So, back to this question. Are changes in agricultural productivity reducing poverty? Here's another message. Growth in productivity is not just about yields. We want to look at something called total factor productivity, and this is something I've been learning a lot about over the last few months. If you do have any detailed questions on TFP, I'm going to have to pass you over to some of my colleagues, but I'll try my best. But it's been a fascinating thing for me to learn about. It's a broader concept of productivity. It's the output considering all inputs. It's not just the yield or the production per unit land area. It's trying to incorporate all the factors that we have. Land, labor, capital, material inputs. And ideally, if we talk about total factor productivity, we want to look at crops and livestock. And this proved to be one of our challenges. Could we get that whole perspective of all these different factors across all these different commodities? That was a really big challenge. But basically, TFP encompasses the average productivity of all inputs employed in the production of all crop and livestock commodities. Iris presented this nice graph to me which tries to describe the difference between total factor productivity in blue and agricultural land productivity, which is what we normally think of as agricultural production. This is for the whole world, average. And what we're seeing is that if you look at the average annual growth rate in agricultural productivity and total factor productivity, they're quite different. They're particularly different or divergent in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but much closer together recently. But still, they're not the same thing. Back to our question. Has increased productivity led to a reduction in rural poverty? Well, the map on the left is showing crop total factor productivity. It's not the whole agricultural sector, it's just the crops. This is the data we could get. We didn't look at livestock in this particular case, and I wish we could in future include that. It would give us a much broader picture of the contribution of agriculture, perhaps in relation to poverty reduction. So this map is showing average annual growth of TFP. The darker the green, the greater the growth. Some very nice stories coming out in central India. Correspondingly, for the same dates, 2004-05 to 2009-10, we have a change in poverty. And here, the darker the red, the greater the reduction in poverty. And you start to see some potentially interesting correlations between the two. And this is what we see, at least, in the data that we have been able to collect so far. Strong TFP growth and reduction in poverty incidence is more evident in rural areas. And what we've done here is just taken a very simple scatter plot of the total factor productivity annual growth, 2004-5 to 2009-10 percentage points, against change in poverty incidence. So here we want to see a positive shift and here a negative shift. And what we see nicely in this quadrant is that each of these dots represents one state of India, and we see that there's a reasonably strong correlation. Most states featuring in this quadrant of the graph. Not quite as compelling a story for urban poverty, but still the trend is in the right way. So at least from the data we see that there's some evidence that the growth in TFP occurs in places also where there's a reduction. We're not talking about any causal relationship here, it's just a correlation in what we see in the data. Something to explore later on. And just what I want to finish off with here is saying that crop TFP, which is what we've been able to get data on by looking across these different crop commodities, looking across the cost of cultivation, the productivity, the yield, it's quite different if we look at total agricultural productivity. And this is from a different data set that has been published, but we wanted to take this through to 2009-10 and we couldn't do it. We just couldn't get all the data sets we needed. So all we're left with here is this comparison to say that these two things are quite different, and until we can get our data to match this one for the latest time series, we won't be able to complete this analysis. So it's work that we want to do by including livestock and other issues. And here we just see that the patterns are diverging in some cases. So we need TFP estimates for agriculture, crops, and livestock if we want to do a more formal analysis of TFP and poverty reduction in India. It's the same story. We always need more data. This never seems to change. But we are getting there. I'm really impressed in India over the last 4 or 5 years how a lot of the ministries and directorates and departments have opened up and made the data available. A lot of it's now online. A lot of it's now almost ready to use out of the box, but there are still some gaps that we haven't been able to fill. Looking at the case study, we see these wonderful spatial patterns of poverty and crop TFP growth in India, but a lot of variation across states, a lot of good stories and a lot of not so good stories. Definitely a correlation between states with higher TFP and greater poverty reduction. But we're starting to see some evidence that the TFP growth in staple crops compared against the growth across all of agriculture is starting to diverge. And we need to understand that more. We need to try and get more information to try and understand what's going there. And we just haven't quite got there with that. But we've pulled together a lot of information. It's now going to be available to others through Geoshare. And I think it will be interesting to see what else is out there. I think as a group we've been working with a lot of the directorates in India, a lot of interest from them to see how this could start to untangle some of the patterns that we see, but we're not quite there in terms of the completeness. And that's our case study for India, so thank you.